Imagine standing before a structure so massive, so perfectly engineered, that even with all our modern technology, we struggle to understand how it was built. Now imagine that this monument is over 4,000 years old, constructed by a civilization that emerged from the heart of Africa when most of the world was still living in scattered villages. Before Greece, before Rome, before Babylon, there was Egypt, a kingdom so powerful, so advanced, that it would rule for 3,000 years, longer than any empire in human history. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Ancient Egypt didn't begin with pyramids and golden masks. It began with something far more mysterious, far more African than most history books dare to admit. This is the untold story of how Africa gave a birth to one of humanity's greatest civilizations, a story of Black Pharaohs, forgotten kingdoms, and a legacy that changed the world forever. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. Today, we journey back to the very beginning of recorded civilization, to a time when the Nile River Valley transformed from scattered communities into the most sophisticated society the ancient world had ever seen. In this documentary, we will uncover the true origins of ancient Egypt, tracing its roots deep into African prehistory. We'll explore how the first pharaohs united a divided land, how they built monuments that still defy explanation, and how they created systems of writing, medicine, mathematics, and governance that would influence every civilization that came after. But this isn't just a story about pyramids and mummies. This is a story about African innovation, African spirituality, and African power. We'll examine the evidence that mainstream historians often overlook, the connections between ancient Egypt and other African civilizations, and the deliberate erasure of Egypt's African identity in modern scholarship. We'll meet the pharaohs who ruled as living gods, the priests who guarded sacred knowledge, the architects who built for eternity, and the ordinary people who made it all possible. We'll witness the rise of dynasties, the construction of immortal monuments, and the creation of a culture so influential that its echoes still resonate 5,000 years later. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just how ancient Egypt rose to greatness, but why this story matters today. You'll see how Africa didn't just contribute to world civilization. Africa created the very foundation upon which all other civilizations were built. Let's begin. Our story begins approximately 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. As massive ice sheets retreated across the northern hemisphere, the climate of North Africa underwent a dramatic transformation. What is now the Sahara Desert was once a green, fertile landscape filled with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Archaeological evidence reveals that ancient African peoples thrived in this region, hunting game, gathering plants, and creating some of humanity's earliest rock art. These weren't primitive savages. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who understood astronomy, tracked seasons, and developed complex spiritual beliefs about their relationship with nature. But around 5000 BCE, the climate shifted again. The Sahara began its transformation into the desert we know today. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual process spanning centuries. As grasslands turned to dust and water sources dried up, the peoples of North Africa faced a choice: migrate or die. Many groups moved southward into sub-Saharan Africa, carrying their knowledge and culture with them, but others turned east toward one of the few water sources that remained reliable, one of the few places where life could still flourish. They turned toward the Nile. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and he wasn't exaggerating. This single river, flowing over 4,000 miles from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, created a narrow ribbon of fertility through an otherwise barren landscape. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood, depositing rich dark soil along its banks. This wasn't destructive flooding, but a predictable, life-giving phenomenon. The ancient Egyptians called this fertile soil Kemet, meaning black land, in contrast to the Deshret, the red land of the desert. This reliable agricultural cycle meant that communities along the Nile could set up permanently, plant crops, and build surplus food stores. Surplus food meant population growth. Population growth meant specialization of labor, and specialization meant the development of arts, crafts, administration, and eventually civilization itself. By 5000 BCE, dozens of independent communities had established themselves along the Nile. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated settlements with organized layouts, specialized workshops, and evidence of long-distance trade. At sites like Badari, Nakada, and Hierakonpolis, we find evidence of advanced pottery making, metalworking, and artistic traditions. These weren't isolated villages, they were interconnected communities that traded goods, shared ideas, and gradually developed common cultural practices. The art from this period reveals a distinctly African aesthetic, similar to traditions found throughout the continent. Elongated figures, ceremonial objects, and spiritual symbolism all point to shared cultural roots with other African peoples. Over centuries, these communities began to coalesce into two distinct regions. In the north, where the Nile spreads into the Mediterranean, numerous settlements formed what would be called Lower Egypt, represented by the Red Crown. In the south, along the narrow river valley, communities united into Upper Egypt, represented by the White Crown. These weren't just geographical divisions, they represented different cultures, different deities, and different ways of organizing society. Lower Egypt was wetter, more accessible to foreign trade, and culturally diverse. Upper Egypt was more isolated, more traditional, and maintained stronger connections to African spiritual practices. This is crucial to understand. Ancient Egypt did not develop in isolation from the rest of Africa. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows clear connections between early Egyptian populations and peoples from Nubia to the south, the Sahara to the west, and the Horn of Africa to the southeast. The religious practices, burial customs, artistic styles, and social structures of pre-dynastic Egypt all show African origins. The worship of animal deities, the importance of ancestor veneration, the concept of divine kingship, all these are fundamentally African traditions that Egypt would refine and elaborate, but not invent. Particularly important was the relationship with Nubia, the land immediately south of Egypt. Nubian culture was, in many ways, more advanced than early Egypt. Nubia had earlier kingdoms, earlier monumental architecture, and maintained crucial trade networks, bringing gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic goods from deep in Africa. By 3500 BCE, the stage was set for something unprecedented in human history. The Nile Valley had everything needed for civilization. Reliable food sources, natural defenses in the form of deserts on both sides, a highway for transportation and communication in the form of the river, and most importantly, a population of skilled, innovative people with centuries of accumulated knowledge. Settlements were growing into towns, towns were developing hierarchies, local leaders were becoming chiefs, chiefs were becoming kings, and kings were looking beyond their own borders, dreaming of something greater. The age of the pharaohs was about to begin. Before we meet the legendary pharaohs who would unite Egypt, we must understand the people they ruled. Ancient Egyptians were a diverse population, but overwhelmingly of African origin, with features reflecting the full spectrum of African phenotypes. Modern DNA studies and skeletal analysis consistently show that ancient Egyptians were indigenous Northeast Africans sharing genetic markers with Nubians, Ethiopians, and other African populations. The famous Egyptologist Sheikh Anta Diop spent decades proving what should have been obvious. Ancient Egyptians were Black Africans. Pre-dynastic Egypt was divided into approximately 42 regions called nomes, each governed by a local ruler called a nomarch. These nomarchs controlled irrigation systems, collected taxes, administered justice, and commanded small armies. Some nomarchs were more powerful than others, controlling strategic locations, fertile lands, or important trade routes. Competition between these local rulers drove innovation in warfare, administration, and monument building. Each wanted to prove their power and secure their legacy. One of the most mysterious figures from this period is known to us only as Scorpion, named after the hieroglyph symbol found near his image on ancient artifacts. The scorpion mace head discovered at Hierakonpolis shows a ruler wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, performing a ceremonial irrigation ritual. Scorpion appears to have been one of the first rulers to attempt unification of multiple nomes under a single authority.